Okay, just wanted to spend the last half hour around the carbon credits. And as Emma said, we got a good flogging on this at the previous training that we did. We sort of started What's Your Carbon project, carbon farming, and then, carbon credits and ACCUs and stuff. So not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I reckon these are the areas that we tend to get a bit more questioning around from a carbon credits point of view. So just a little background, an ACCU is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. So whatever we stop methane, then we get credited 28 times that in carbon dioxide equivalents. Everybody be familiar with that. Sequestration, particularly, but they come with obligations. And we need to fully understand those obligations because, as I said just before lunch, some examples of one in particular I was working through, there's probably $1 million worth of carbon credits theoretically over that 25-year period. If everything went according to plan from a soils point of view, the farmers or the investors still didn't go ahead with it because of other reasons. So there are other obligations with that crediting that you need to be aware of. But for a lot of people, they're saying, I don't want to actually make money out of carbon. I just want to be able to use the carbon I may store on my farm for my own use. So there's that tension between, is it selling and having obligations on the farm, or is it to retain yourself? And the other one, which I've put up because it's become really prominent in the last 12 months, people may not have been following this, and I've actually put this as one of the articles in your pack of notes, is others buying ag land. I made mention of the Gina Reinhardt one because that's close to our area that I work in, but it's happening everywhere, particularly with the big companies. And they're doing 2 things. One is that they're buying land, and secondly, they are buying into some of the carbon service providers, so that instead of buying land and then, in a sense, subcontracting out the creation of ACCUs that then they would buy back and having the cost associated with that, they're trying to do a lot of this now in-house, where they can go through the process and generate their own credits without having to go through a third party. And they're just buying the expertise that's been created in some of these carbon farming companies that are out there, private companies that are out there. So there's a bit of that happening, and I imagine there'll be a bit more in that as well, in this what we call the offset game of buying and creating your own credits. And so that article is there. It's an Age article only from about a month ago. As we know, it's managed by the Clean Energy Regulator. There has been a bit of noise over the last 6 months or so about the function and the role of the Clean Energy Regulator, particularly where some of the sequestration credits that have been issued have come under fire. And I suspect over time that we'll see the Clean Energy Regulator broken up into different components, because at the moment the regulator has a number of roles. It does that calculation of our national greenhouse gas account, so that purpley looking document that you've got of what were our emissions each year. It's responsible for doing that. It's also responsible for operating the ACCU scheme, and so issuing ACCUs and doing all of that sort of stuff. It also maintains the register of those ACCUs, because each ACCU has got a unique number associated with it, so it can be tracked of who actually owns that and when were they issued, and if they've been sold, who they've been sold to, and so on. It's a bit like a share register, so they run the same sort of thing. And they also operate the Australian Carbon Exchange, where ACCUs can be traded as well. So this is where you get this spot price of what ACCUs are up to. So they actually have a finger in a number of different pies, and some people are arguing that some of those could be producing conflicts as far as running all of those different arms or elements. So it's likely the Clean Energy Regulator may be, some of those functions may appear in some other agency at some other stage on the way through. But there is a carbon exchange, so you can actually get the spot price of ACCUs being traded on the market. Should be remembered that when this first started, the Australian government, when they created these ACCUs, the Australian government was the only buyer of those ACCUs, so there was no secondary market. It was only the Australian government that could buy it, and they used to have what was called a reverse auction twice a year. And people who had generated ACCUs carbon credits could sell them to the government. They were the only people they could sell them to if they wanted to, and it was at a lease cost. So you would say, I want $15 for these credits, and someone else might say, I'm happy to sell my credits for $12. The government had a pot of money, and they would keep buying until that pot of money ran out, and they were buying ACCUs at the lease cost. And that operated up until about the end of 2021, early 2022, when then they invited the private market to be part of that as well. And that's where we got this private trading scheme. But it certainly didn't start off that way. And the Australian government still runs their reverse auctions, but they're much smaller and with much less fanfare than they are now. I think if we think about the Australian government side of things and the Australian government creating credits, it's often referred to as the compliance market. And so the ACCUs and the ACCU eligibility is in what we call a compliance market. And that really just means that it's a government instituted, government run, government sort of regulated type market. And those markets, so if we're creating ACCUs, they have a number of requirements to meet those if you want to meet the compliance market and create an ACCU. And I've tried to summarise these because while there's some commonality in all the ACCUs, different methods that you can use to generate ACCUs have different requirements. So I've just tried to summarise these. I mentioned yesterday that I have a checklist sometimes if I'm going through the carbon, any independent carbon projects that are being offered, and this is really my checklist. Some of the features that are in here, which I'll mention. First one, if you want to be eligible for an ACCU, you have to register the project before it commences. So you can't start, for example, you couldn't plant a tree today, register a project tomorrow and want to claim ACCUs on those trees. It has to be in the reverse order. They have to be registered before you can actually go about undertaking the actions. There is a little bit of flexibility in there now about how much scoping you can do in a project to check its viability or its feasibility before you register a project, where before they were pretty strict on that. If you started doing some preliminary investigations of soil tests and stuff, you got pinged for that because they said, no, you've already started your project. They're a bit more lenient on it now. Has to pass though the newness or additionality test. And simply what this means is that it has to be in addition to what you are already doing or already have done. So it can't just be more of the same and saying, I want to get credits for more of the same. So it's got to be new or it's got to be additional. As part of this, and it's quite often not emphasised, is that you need to baseline your current emissions anyway. In any crediting scheme, they have a provision in there which is called leakage or avoidance of leakage. And what that means is that you can't be credited if your emissions have also increased. Your amount of credits will be lessened because of that, because you have to cover your increase in emission over that registration period. So for argument's sake, if there was a project you were doing and you got 100 credits in sequestration, but your emissions over the period that those 100 credits were created, you increased your baseline emissions, say from 1,000 tonnes to 1,050, you've increased your emissions by 50 tonnes. In simple terms, 50 tonnes would come off the 100 tonnes of credits you got. So you would only get 50 tonnes crediting in simple terms, and there's lots of other discounts and shit that goes on after that. But in simple terms, that's what it means. So when I say to people, even if we're thinking about doing a carbon project, you still have to do a baseline. Now, the baselining in some of the ACCU methods is different to the GAF tools, okay? But say, for example, if it's livestock, it's still livestock numbers of those different livestock classes on a seasonal basis that you do your calculation on. You still need to know your fuel, your fertiliser, your electricity, whether you've used lime, all of that sort of stuff. So the vast majority of information that you collect that we were talking about yesterday in calculating your emissions, you need to be able to do this as part of being eligible for carbon credit projects as well. Okay, so the baselining still needs to be done. So why wouldn't you start with your emissions and getting a handle on that before you move into this side of it? And you need the baseline if it's particularly soil carbon project, your current carbon stocks. And I think Ed made mention of that. And usually there's a 2 time frame period. They don't just take one value. It's usually over a 2 time frame period to set that sort of baseline figure, and then it moves from there. Bit of flexibility on how it's done, up and downs, but the basic premise is that your baseline, what you're emitting, and your baseline, what your stocks are, and you in sense get it paid for the net changes over time. Calculation of leakage, which I mentioned before, that's why you need those current emissions, so that you can work out what that leakage might be. You have to nominate a permanency period. And as I said, in Australia, we've got the option of 25 years. Most places around the world, 100 years is the permanency period, but you nominate that. You can nominate 100 years. If you nominate a shorter permanency period in Australia, there is a greater discount. And basically what that means is that of the credits that you create, there's a larger portion of it that is actually held in trust, so to speak, and potentially can be released later on. But essentially there's some of those that are held behind. All the schemes have, in one way, shape or form, make good provisions. And that's just a collective term that I've used, that if there are certain events, and I know people have asked events, what if there's a wildfire? What if we have a drought? What if we have this or that? There are provisions in the Act and the legislation to allow you to make good, depending on the reason for that change, particularly negative change in carbon stocks to occur. So if, for example, it was a drought or a wildfire, there is the opportunity to replenish those at the next accounting period when things become good or the plants start to regrow again, without actually having to pay back anything. So there's an opportunity that you can either dip into the buffer or make good in the next measurement if there's been a positive increase in that. They frown on actions that are what you might call might be man-made or deliberate. So, for example, if you were getting credited for a tree project and then you decided to clear a third of it and sell it for firewood, or sell the debris for firewood, then they would say that's not in the spirit of what we're trying to do, and you would need to make good then if credits had been issued for that material that had been dropped and then you've gone and on-sold them. So, bit of flexibility, that's between the department and the minister about what is allowed and not allowed in that make good provisions, but just be aware that they have them in the different schemes. There is a legal recognition of encumbrance on the land. So that basically means it goes on title, and if you've got a mortgage, then the banks have to be involved in that as well, and any other parties that have got any encumbrance on that land, and that goes on the land. So if you go to sell it and you're selling it with a project that is live, then the purchaser of that has to be informed about that encumbrance on the land, which in a number of cases with clients as we work through that, they found that as a big disincentive and one of the reasons why they didn't go ahead with the project, even though it may have created a few credits. You need to have independent audits, so you've got to pay for that separately, as well as the independent measuring over certain measurement periods, which Ed alluded to. Usually ranges between 3 and 5 years, sometimes 1 year, but usually sort of that 3 or 5 years, you've got to nominate a number of times that you want to remeasure or have them audited. And just finally, just remember they are a financial product and there are tax implications with that. So advising on ACCUs, they're looking at loosening the definition around this at the moment, but historically it's been considered a financial product. So you need to have a financial services license to advise on the buying and selling and ACCUs. So just remember there is that financial side of it as well, and talking to clients about the tax implications. The tax implications is when those credits are realised and cashed in, and so that has some implications sometimes for succession and estate planning and stuff like that. Okay, so that's the compliance market. That's the government market, and in Australia we've had a real focus on this because the Australian government was very upfront about wanting to create credits and run a scheme with certain rules, if you like, and regulations around it. Of the number of schemes that are there, this is in your notes as well. We saw this at the last training workshop that we did. So if you're thinking of any sort of a carbon sequestration project, whether it's in soils or vegetation, they've created this. It's now a little bit out of date because some of these methods have been closed. But if you want to store carbon in soils or different tree options that you're thinking of, this little flow chart, even though it's really fuzzy here, that's why I've got it as a PDF in your notes as well. If you answer those questions, then it takes you down to what are the methods that potentially you could consider to allow those credits to occur. And they've got hyperlinks on it, so it does take you to the method, the detailed legislation and the regulations in the method of how that occurs. So it's a useful one if you're starting to think about what might our options be. Okay, and as I said, some of this needs to be updated because some of these methods no longer exist. So that one, Mallee Planning with full cam, that's now a different version. It closed at the end of September this year. But it does give you a bit of an idea. And so it answers some of the questions about, oh, why don't I chop those trees down and replant them and call it a new project? You know, has the area been cleared in the last 7 years or 5 years if it's changed hands? And if you answer no to that, then you're not eligible. So there are some of these upfront built-in restrictions on whether you're eligible for a project even before you move into the detail around them. I just want to mention just where ACCUs have been created because people have got a bit of a curiosity around this. There are a large number of ACCUs that have been generated and paid out by the Australian, or generated by the Australian government and paid by the Australian government who have bought them back. I've just looked at the number of projects. So there's two things. You can register a project. Remember, you had to register that at the start. And then if the project is accumulating carbon, according to the method, you will get a credit for those. So there's really two bits of reporting I'll show you here. One is how many projects are registered, and then how many projects have actually gone through and ACCUs have been issued for them. You can find this on the website. All the links I've put in the notes that I've got there. So if you want to find them, that's pretty easy. I've just pulled out the agricultural ones as of about a month ago of where we sat with them. So there are 4 methods, and I've bundled a lot of the vegetation ones together. But you can see most of the projects registered are in vegetation. There is actually quite a number in soils, but very few in these other 2 sort of agricultural methods. So it's really soils and vegetation where a lot of projects have been registered. If we actually look at the number of ACCUs that have been issued against those 4, the vast majority of them are in the vegetation space. Okay, about 82 million ACCUs have been issued in the vegetation space. The soils one, if you're struggling to find it, that's because it's this one up here. Okay, now, so very few soil ACCUs. While you see press releases and stuff about ACCUs that people are making out of soils, in reality of all the number of ACCUs that have been issued, and in particular compared to the number of projects that have been registered, currently it's pretty small. That could be a function of just these projects taking a number of years before they get to their second and third measurement sort of periods, and therefore no crediting has been done, but they are accumulating carbon. But at the moment, there are very few that have been issued in the soil space up to this date. That may increase a lot more. The other thing, if we just look at the vegetation one, which is the vast majority of them, and where there's been a fair bit of noise in the last 12 or 18 months or so, is that most of those ACCUs that have been issued have been in 2 areas. One called human-induced regrowth or human-induced regeneration, or the HIR method, it's been called, very popular up in Northern Australia. And the second one is the avoiding clearing or deforestation ones. So this one here, if you agree to not chop your trees down and you had license to chop those trees down, you get a credit for them. And so if you can remember the graph yesterday that had the bars below the x-axis of tree forestation or credits that we're getting from the vegetation sector, they're coming from these types of credits as one source of them. Okay, And the second one is human-induced regrowth. Now, the human-induced regrowth is largely driven by computer modelling and allowing areas that are earmarked to regrow naturally, or for actions that you take to allow that regeneration to occur, to encourage that regeneration to occur on that land. So that will be things like destocking and stuff like that that allows those things to occur. There's been a lot of noise around this, as I said, on two fronts. One is that the guys that originally designed the program and the full CAM model that it relies on to make those estimates have overestimated how much has grown back. So they're getting paid substantially on the modelling side of it, even though physically what has grown back doesn't match what the model is suggesting. But because of the method, they're getting paid on the model calculations. And the second one is that they've actually agreed in some areas where that landscape never had vegetation on it in the first place, but they've actually accepted them as you will get human-induced regrowth on them, not planting, but just human-induced regrowth, and there hasn't been any regrowth because they historically weren't tree vegetation or vegetation anyway. So there's a bit of argy-bargy going on at the moment between those two. There was a review done by Ian Chubb, and he said that while some of these methods need a bit of a tidy up, essentially the ACCU type scheme is pretty sound as far as that goes. But some of the methods are a bit dodgy, and they happen to be the methods where virtually all of the credits in the ag sector have been generated from at this point in time. I'll keep running through and then we'll have a few questions at the end. Yeah. So all of this stuff I've been talking about is the compliance market or the government-driven stuff. And in Australia, we think that's where the carbon market is. Australia is a bit unique compared to the rest of the world. Australia has a very strong government intervention in this and a government issuing of carbon credits, which has largely excluded the private sector from creating credits. So the private sector is a very small part in the Australian landscape, where if you go to other places around the world, virtually all the carbon crediting and the carbon trading and stuff is all done in the private market and has no government involvement or interference with it at all. So we're just in a slightly unique position in Australia compared to a lot of other countries. So there is the voluntary market that exists. And there's nothing stopping any business from setting up and creating carbon credits under their own name, creating a method under their own name. And if they can find a willing creator of those credits and they can find a willing buyer of those credits in the private market, there is nothing to stop that transaction occurring. Okay? The Science-Based Targets initiative is designed to increase the credibility around that. So as you could probably imagine with that simple description of the voluntary market, we have everything from quite credible credits that are being created to absolute junk. Okay, and the junk exists in Australia. I did a job about 2 years ago, and the bloke warned me before I went up there. This is in northeast Victoria, of a bloke that was selling carbon credits. He was selling 1 year of credit on the overseas market, traded out of Singapore, for the carbon you already had stored in your soil. Okay, and they were finding willing buyers of those credits, so they created the credit based on the carbon that you had there. But to be eligible for the scheme, you had to pay, I think it was $6,000 a farm to sign up. And there is nothing stopping that occurring. Okay, in the US, just in the last week or so, there have been a couple of companies that are being sued at the moment because credits that they said they created didn't exist. So they're being prosecuted around that for false sale. So there's a huge range in the voluntary market. We're not exposed to a lot of that in Australia, as I said, because of the strength of the ACCU market. And so most of our carbon providers that are registered in the the Carbon Market Institute, are dealing in ACCUs. So if you like, they have the safeguards that were back around here. So the credits around the world, the ACCU scheme is considered a very high standard one because of the requirements that are inbuilt into those as far as the credibility of those credits. In the voluntary market, this one here, you in fact have no safeguards apart from, as I said, what is coming in now, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative to try and clean that up. There are hundreds of players in this market. These are the biggest two, a group called Verra, or the Verified Carbon Standard, and Gold Standard. So one's a US one, one's a European one. They're the two that have got the biggest share of the voluntary market around the world, and it's pretty huge. I checked recently, Verra have only got about 1 million credits in the Australian market at the moment, where they've created voluntary credits that people in Australia have created those credits and are selling around the world to other people. And that's not registered by anybody else but Verra, but you can go into Verra and you can find the register of those projects. But if you put it in the scheme of hundreds of millions of credits that have been created through the ACCU scheme, it's really small bickies as far as that goes. So there'll be lots of these people out there operating around the world, and some of them are pushing into the Australian market to see what opportunity there is to do this. But just remember, if you're playing with any of these, they're not creating ACCUs. Okay, they are creating their own credits, and all of the rules and regulations around those credits are entirely up to these companies to determine. There's no, in a sense, independent auditor as such. Having said that, and I've put it in the notes there now, because with any market, people see opportunity. So there are now ratings agencies around the carbon credits and the validity of these carbon credits. Okay. I've got some links in a couple of examples there in your notes as well. So they give it a credit rating. It's a bit like Standard & Poor's, or those who, and they give them a AAA plus credit rating or a 2A plus credit rating. So people, if they're buying them, know what standard those credits are at. And it's really about the safeguards and the permanency and the legalities of them all, and basically how credible they are as a credit in the private market. I say to people, if you ever wanted to go down this path here and do this sort of thing here, if you use those ACCU eligibility as a bit of guidance. So what I mean by that is this list here. If you use those, and so if you ask people, do we have to baseline our emissions? Do we have to calculate leakage? Because I've had some of these private schemes that I've looked at and I said, well, what are we doing about calculating leakage? Oh, don't worry about that. So that means you could create 100 credits in the same period, emit 200 tonnes more than you did before, and you get a credit for 100 units, when in fact you've added 100 emissions to the atmosphere. So this becomes a pretty handy list, I reckon, to check off against some of these organisations that are here, okay, as far as that goes. And also including the methodology of how that's done. And if we've got time, I can go back and run through the issue around the Microsoft one with Wilmot Farms if people are interested, because that's a real good case study of this example. And I think this might be my last slide that I've got on this. I mentioned in the tree stuff that there may be a possibility in Australia to get recognition for trees that have been planted beforehand. Remember, they won't make the eligibility criteria for an ACCU because the project wasn't registered before the trees were planted, and therefore it fails the newness or the additionality test. But as I showed you in that graph, they are actually accumulating carbon in future years. And so to try and improve, I suppose, the fairness of that and the recognition of that, Climate Active, which is run through the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, is contemplating an accounting for carbon removal from tree plantings that have been established post-1990. I've put the draft guidelines, so I've put this document in there. So if you want to know a bit more about how that works and scheme and all that stuff, that's there. I've dragged the chain on this. This has been sort of floating around for the last 2 years, and they haven't actually made it available yet. The main thing that's tricking them up is how we calculate the leakage side of it, because when they first put it out, there was no leakage provision in it. So they picked up that they need to have the leakage provision in this as well, so that you're not producing emissions and then claiming credits through this. They've got a couple of other rules around this because they're not as rigorous as the ACCUs. One is that they can't be traded to anybody else, so you can only use them within your own business. So they talk about insetting these credits. These credits will likely to have a vintage period. And what that means is you can't accumulate credits beyond a certain number of years. You have to use them, otherwise they expire. So I couldn't register a project now and use those credits from 10 years ago against a product. They're saying the credits have to be used within the short time frame of when they've been created. And there's likely to be a cost associated with it because it still requires all that sort of auditing stuff, the measurement stuff, the calculation on full cam, and so on. So there's quite a bit of paperwork that goes with this, not quite as onerous they're suggesting as what the ACCUs are, but it does give the opportunity for people that have planted some trees over time who don't want to go down that full ACCU approach to potentially get some credits for these. But I'd warn people that the credits for these are only valuable if you can monetize them further down in the supply chain. So if the supply chain doesn't give a stuff whether you're 9 kilos of CO2 per kilo of beef or 3 kilos of CO2 because you've used some of these credits, if they're going to pay you the same, then all you've incurred is a cost with creating the credits and getting nothing out the other end. So we're pretty keen on this, but we still have to have the market that is going to reflect a lower carbon emission product for it to be viable, I think, to jump into something like this. And that's, so you'll get credits. Say if we started off here, you'd get credits for that bit going forward over time. There's some different things that I've put in your pack. There's the Woodside article that I mentioned. I could have done any of 50 of them. Alan Kohler had one on the ABC News, if anybody watched that over the weekend, called them carbon discredits because of the questioning around how valid those human-induced regeneration projects were. The Ian Chubb review, that's his summarised statement. The decision tree that I mentioned before, the ACCU scheme register, project register. So if you want to rechange those graphs and do different things, I've just put all the data in there. That was in August 24 when I pulled that down, and just some updated draft guidelines for carbon accounting stuff.